So first of all, I want to thank Sherry for accepting that invitation. I would like to start by asking you to situate your trajectory as an intellectual, as a scholar, in relationship to I'll repeat the question. So I wish to ask you to situate your intellectual trajectory as a literary scholar within the field of translation studies. So what made you interested in translation and the relationship between literature and translation?
Well, that's a great question, Vincent, to start with, because Vincent knows that the word trajectory is a word I like very much because it's both intellectual and physical, geographical. And my trajectory, as I think many Montreal intellectuals, scholars, artists, has to do a lot with the geography of the city and with moving across the city. So I started out as an adolescent crossing the city, being attracted by what was on the other side of the city, then having to, in fact, do a detour via Paris to get to the other side of the city, because it was very difficult as an Anglo in the olden days to actually make contact with French Canada. I mean, there were ways, but it was easier in a certain way to go through Paris, and that was my chosen path. So I studied in Paris with Roland Barthes, and that gave me, I guess, a perspective through which I could then come back and read Quebec Society, then I came to teach in a French department in an English university, which I enjoyed very much, the décalage between the two. And I went on to live in a neighborhood that was very much between English and French, Montreal, and that meant a lot to me. That came to be, in a sense, the ground out of which I became, or through which I could actually study literature and society. I didn't know it at first, but it became a lens through which I could look at relations between French and English Canada. I think it was interesting that, I mean, in all of these moves, I'm certainly not alone. There was what we forget often when the story of the Quiet Revolution is told, and the story of parti pris and the great effervescence of the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Quebec, is that there were many, many Anglos like me who were very attracted to French Canada. And to me, the emblematic story of that attraction is Malcolm Reed's book, which was called The Shouting Sign Painters, where he talks about how he, during the 60s, kind of fell in love with the parti pris movement and with the writers of the parti pris movement. And there was a huge, actually huge, a sizable group of Anglos who came to Quebec during that time, attracted by what was going on in Quebec. And in fact, many of those became translators. So that actually recently I edited a volume in honor of Sheila Fishman, and she was one of those people who came to Quebec, attracted by Quebec culture during that time, and like many others, Ray Chamberlain, David Homel, I mean, I could name many who who, out of their attraction to what was going on during this nationalist movement, this cultural nationalist movement in the 60s and 70s, developed particular skills, which were translational skills. I mean, they might have been improvised at first, but then they became adept readers of Quebec society and began this kind of back and forth movement that has enriched both sides, I think, very much.
And your interest for translation, I think, started from a very pragmatic experience of translating, of being a translator.
Yes.
And then shifted towards the study of translation. That was new, I guess, at the time.
Yeah, this is true. In fact, I had the great good luck of translating Michel Foucault. I was a co-translator of the essays and interviews of Michel Foucault that I was able to do with in collaboration with a professor at McGill called Don Bouchard. And we translated these essays. And then I started to teach translation and became aware of how useful translation can be in many ways. As you say, translation has many aspects to it. I mean, the purely linguistic, you could say. The fact that all translation implies sameness and difference at the same time. It's always a fascinating mixture. It's trying to say the same thing, but necessarily through a different language and through, in a different temporality. Translation always comes after, so there's a question of temporality. The translation is never the same thing as the original. And in fact, the travel can be such that, for instance, Borges, let me get this right, would say that often the original is unfaithful to its translation because translations take on a life of their own and they have a reality of their own over and above the life of the original. But translation is also a lens and a perspective on cultural change. How do concepts move? How did the concepts of French theory move from France to Quebec or to the States, for instance? How does feminism move from one context to the other? How did the gay rights movement move from one to the other across languages, across legislative systems, across conceptions of difference? So translation has become increasingly a fantastic lens through which to study the movement of ideas through time.
Yes, and I think that now there's a surge of interest in translation, in cultural transfer of theory in France in particular, which is interesting. Number of historians are now trying to map out history of ideas as they shifted from France to the United States, like François Cusset, for instance, with his book French Theory. But I would like to shift towards that issue, and because we had a conversation before, and you mentioned often, you know, the kind of reaction of people will be that these shifts are diverting the meaning of the text, or there are also some commodification of ideas. But you mentioned the productive or progressive effects of these translations. So in terms of, on one side, kind of broadening of the audience, the lector, the readership of these texts, and also the way that they were recycled or appropriated by other groups. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in a way, you could say that increasingly, I think, translation has become a way of thinking of all cultural transmission. So instead of thinking about cultural transmission as something which is seamless and transparent, so an idea moves from one space to another and is received in exactly the same way, or a text is read and then is read in exactly the same way. Of course, we know that the history of text is a history of new interpretations, and it's a history of movement across ideas, and those movements are enriching. That difference is intensely productive and illuminating. So the examples that are sometimes taken as exceptions, in fact, I think they're more like models of how ideas are transmitted, how ideas are passed down. So if you take, we know that Jacques Derrida, for instance, in France is read as a philosopher. But when Derrida was read in the United States, and he became fantastically more popular in the United States than in France, he was read as a literary critic, and his work was taught in literature departments, not in philosophy departments. Michel Foucault and Roland Barthes became gay in the United States. They weren't gay in France. They were just French intellectuals who perhaps they happened to be homosexual on the side. People might have, everybody knew that, but that wasn't important to know about them in France. In the United States, their gayness became really important, and that very much colored the way in which they were received and in which their work was read, in illuminating ways. Feminism has been really interesting, the way that feminism has moved. In fact, I like the example I like to use in terms of, even if you think of Montreal, about ideas moving from one side to the other of Montreal, what you might have called phallogocentrique in French became male chauvinist in English. And that distinction shows you, a great deal about how you think about feminism and how you think about gender difference. So concepts of gender have been notoriously difficult to translate, and not only linguistically, of course. The word gender itself is difficult because we have in English gender and genre for literary genre. In French, you only have genre to cover everything, and that had to do a lot with the fact that feminism in France was intensely influenced by psychoanalysis, for instance, which was not the case in the United States. So the passage of writings by feminist writers from France to French feminist theory was studied for the ways in which it was transformed. But now what's interesting is that it's now being studied in the opposite direction, because someone like Judith Butler, who at a certain point, American feminist theorists might have been sort of working through translations. Now they've in some sense become the originals who are being translated by the French. And her book, Gender Trouble, caused a great deal of trouble to the translators, and it's translated as trouble dans le genre, which sounds like trouble in the house of the prison. It's a difficult. These are difficult things. You can make. Sometimes they seem comical, but they're very difficult things to do. But not because it's a technical problem, because it's a problem of thought. And that's why translation studies is so interesting, is because you get a sense of all the perspectives of the elements that go into translating that thought.
Well, often in these books, both the French text is translated into English, and the opposite, the most recent phenomenon of Judith Butler and others being translated into French. There's prefaces,
Yes.
where the translator has a voice. And what I noticed reading these prefaces is that there's a sense of urgency most of the time of making that text available to another readership. And that readership doesn't exist, or it exists, but it's kind of fragmented. And in the preface, the translator is trying to map out that readership, but there's also often a political project that is transpiring through that text, the preface.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, I think we often give too narrow a role to the translator. There are many translators who are more like mediators and who give a thickness to the process of mediation. So they're not just translating the text, but then they'll write a preface and they'll introduce the ideas. Someone who's, an example might be Ray Ellenwood, who translated Bourdieu, who translated his writings, and in particular the Refus Global. In fact, the Refus Global was translated for the first time in its entirety in 1985. It was written in 1948. And Ray Ellenwood has become not only the translator of Bourdieu, but a very important mediator, someone who writes about the work, who explains the translation, and who actually organizes shows. So this kind of mediator is really important. Another person like that is Brian Masumi, who's probably most of you know his name, who was the translator of Deleuze, but not just the translator of the text. He's the translator of his thought into English, and the author of works on which have made his own sort of original contribution to Deleuzian philosophy. So those kinds of translator mediators are really important people, and they've played a larger role, I think, in the history of thought than we've paid attention to.
So as a follow-up to that, could you talk a little bit about or sketch up what could be an history of reception of these ideas in Montreal, in a city, you wrote a lot about that in your books, in a city that has a very complex institutional configuration with 4 universities, so 2 English, many English universities, and 2 French universities. And it seems for me that there's it's a perfect context to think about what we call French theory, because here we experience this kind of proximity. The 2 linguistic cultures are so close to each other. So I have the impression that the gap between the publishing of one text and its translation would be shorter here because of that. So could you talk a little bit about this context in relationship to these?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we should be the translators of French theory here. We should be the translators of theory. We should be on the map of translation in a way that I think we're unfortunately not. I think, yes, we're the natural translators. Jacques Rousseau said we're the natural translators of American literature, for instance. That a lot of, I'm talking about literary texts, whether it be, Philip Roth or or writers who talk a lot about baseball, or even Mordecai Richler. You know, a lot of these texts have unfortunately been translated in Paris with none of the cultural knowledge that should be. And I don't know how many of you remember the disastrous Barney's version that was published in Paris, but it got everything wrong, including, what was it, La Tasse de Stanley? Stanley Cup, La Tasse de Stanley. And other, you know, and La Fusée for the rocket. And bloopers that are really unforgivable, because the French translators had absolutely no interest in finding out what the cultural reality is in Quebec. So why aren't we, you know, Quebec francophones, translating American literature here, and the opposite, translating from French into English, you know, translating French in the other way. Well, institutional, let's call it colonialism, because translation goes through the institutions that were, you know, publishing happens in Paris and in New York, and very little of the translating in Canada gets that market. We translate for each other, so we're translating Canadian literature for each other. That's nice. That's sympathique, but it's not putting us on the international map of literary relations, nor is it putting us on the map of you know, the social sciences and humanities. I think this area has been neglected a lot. That there has been much less attention paid to how important the translations of the concepts are, and how we could do that work very well here, and I hope we do. We do translate somewhat. We travel from one university to the other. I always used to, you know, get a big thrill when I'd get on my bike and I'd be at the Université de Montreal talking about Bourdieu, and then I'd get on my bike and I'd be at the Jewish Public Library talking about, you know, A.M. Klein, and then I'd get on my bike and I'd go to it and be talking about F.R. Scott or something, and how you know, how exciting a kind of disparities and distances we can have in this city, because we move between these different universes, and we can do this personally. But institutionally, I think we haven't done it as well as we should be doing it.
Yes. And you think it could be a project in the near future to retranslate some of these books here?
Yeah. With the help of...
yeah.
Yes, I think so.
I guess one aspect of your, an important aspect of your work is the study of urbanity in relationship to language, and you took Montreal as well, I was to say case study, but it's not really the case, since it's your city, the city in which you live. But you said that this relationship between urban and language was somehow neglected, and you were surprised that it was, it became a central topic in your research. So could you talk about again this trajectory and how also events, political events, since I would say we can start. We can start with the 90s, and then you can talk more about your recent research on the 40s. But how political events shape your understanding of this relationship between the urban and language.
Yes, certainly the 90s were very important. The 90s, I think, were the nadir in many ways of cultural relations in Montreal. Montreal was a very depressed city. Montreal was a very, very divided, very polarized city. And I became aware as I listened to politicians, as I listened to debates, and I remember especially the very acrimonious Richler polemic, which was unfortunately rather gratuitous and I think very, unfortunate. Realizing that what was happening on the ground was so different from what we were hearing on the radio and from the mouths of our politicians. And that a neighborhood like the one I was living in was really very polyglot, fluid, all kinds of translation going on, all kinds of new relationships being created among people in neighborhoods. And yet all we heard from politicians was this very sterile, acrimonious divisions. And the people you met didn't correspond to the identities that were being forced on us by these debates. So that made me very interested in looking at the city differently and looking at the city on the ground and seeing how different neighborhoods had really forged separate identities that were very different, that this East-West debate that so much dominated Montreal history, French, English, was really very skewed. If you looked at the North-South, for instance, trajectory, you had something very different. If you looked at Gabriel Roy's story of Montreal, you had Westmount versus Saint-Henri. That was a very different understanding of Montreal, a class-based and not a language-based understanding, also race-based, because to look at Saint-Henri through the novels of Mortley Callahan's The Loved and the Lost, for instance, which talked about this very rich jazz culture in the area around Sienne, Porters, etc., in the Boulevard Saint-Antoine. So to look at different trajectories, to look at different relationships, was really to break through this very sterile and unhappy, forced identities that we were that were imposed on us. So it occurred to me that one could look at the city as a series of translations, or look at the history of mediators moving through the city as a series of more or less successful translations. So some translators were successful and some less successful. The 60s seem to have a privileged hold on our imaginations, because the 60s were the time of the Quiet Revolution. Everything changed in the 60s. So much excitement, so much that marked today's Montreal, today's Quebec. But the 40s show us a different city, and a city that was only possible before the 60s. The story of the 60s is the progressive translation of Montreal towards French, right? The fact that Montreal becomes increasingly French, that its culture is defined as Francophone, and that all the other cultures are now somehow embraced within the fold of French. So we have multiple cultures, but French is the main, the tutelary, the dominant language into which those other histories have translated. The 40s was a different configuration, and in particular in relation to the art world and to the notion of modernity. And I'm still investigating, and I'd be interested in any reactions, but I'm still investigating the idea that Montreal was totally unique in the 1940s, in that it had three separate, autonomous, vibrant, modernist movements in as many languages. So the 40s was the éclosion of modernism in French. Bourgeois, Revue Globale in 1948, but by even beginning in 1942, Bourgeois was holding his salon on Rue Montana. The 40s are also a time when English language modernism, Montreal is the capital of English language modernism. And we forget to what extent anybody who was anybody lived in Montreal or came to Montreal. All the English language modernists that you can think of lived in Montreal. Even Margaret Atwood came to Montreal in the 50s. This was the place to be. And it was not only a literary movement, but it was a visual arts movement, as you know. I mean, modernism starting in the 20s is extremely important in Montreal. And then a third modern movement, which is Yiddish speaking. This was a group of people who were very productive poets, novelists, productive in many other ways, with very important syndicalist unions, educational movements, but also visual arts. So if you look at the map, if you could actually map this out, you can see that, for instance, Paul Durand had his salon on Rue Montana. F.R. Scott he actually held La Tenue Salon. He had his Wednesday evenings in his house in Westmount. And on Rue Esplanade, middle ways between, you had Ida Maza, who also held a literary salon, where many luminaries of the Yiddish language world would come from elsewhere. It was a time of course, it was a time horrible. It was the war years, but subsequent to the war years, those many survivors came to Montreal. Many important writers came to visit, and you still had this important visual arts movement. So in the same city, on points of the map, not terribly far one from the other, you had these three very vibrant movements, largely ignorant one of the other. Largely, not entirely, but where there were a few mediators who moved from one to the other, but not many. But there were some. F.R. Scott was a translator. Many of the visual artists were more mobile than the literary people, for, I think, obvious reasons, because literary people are more tied to language. But in the same city, three foundational movements. I'm not talking about just, passing ephemeral movements. There are always scenes, where you have ephemeral movements. But these were three foundational movements, each giving birth to important inheritances of bodies of work. And I think this may be very unusual, and I think it accounts for some of the attractiveness of Montreal as a city today. That is to say that the divisions of the past and the fact that there were these separate, autonomous, divided communities has given birth to a kind of interaction that we have now that are possible because of these previous divisions. That is, the divisions gave rise to these separate identities, and the separate identities then interact through different kinds of translation to produce the art world and the literary world that we have today. So anyway, I'd be interested in the comments of others who might have some thoughts on that as well.
For questions or comments?
So we have a microphone. I would really appreciate it if you have questions, if you could ask your question into the microphone so everyone can hear you, and also so your question can be included on our documentation of this conversation. Does anybody have a question?
There's two things I want to ask you. First of all, you grew up learning English. At what point did you feel that French was becoming a language that you were comfortable in? Because you weren't learning French as you were growing up. So one of the things I've always found interesting is that the languages that you learn, your formative years, you learn without knowing. And so they become part of you automatically. You don't learn grammar, it just becomes part of you. But any other language that you're learning after that, you were learning with rules. So at what point did you feel that you were comfortable with French?
That took the detour via Paris, unfortunately, in a certain way. I mean, I'm not sure that I would have been as comfortable had it not been that's a kind of a colonialist thing, and I was not the only one of my generation to have to transit through Paris in order to cross the city, because there are no more conflictual relationships, I think, than those of two close neighbors in a city, and neighbors that were very fraught. The time when as I was growing up, as of my generation, there were huge tensions in the very act of crossing the city, and so there was attraction, but there was fear. So I think many Anglos were faced with those two things, the attraction and the fear. And it was overcoming the fear that I think took, the possibility of learning the language. But it wasn't just the language. I think you had to find some mode of integration as well, and whether that was intellectual or. I think it's hard to remember to what extent there was that fraught a relationship. And even when I was in Paris and I would go to the Centre Culturel Canadien, I would really try to hide my accent. Really. I was just praying that I wouldn't be caught. I wouldn't be caught out as an Anglo, because it was a very uncomfortable thing to be. So learning the language is one thing, and then at the same time feeling comfortable on the other side is the other. And this took time.
Well, I find it interesting. One of the books that influenced me so much about understanding my own journey was Eva Hoffman's Lost in Translation. Yes. And as an immigrant, when I started to learn English, you lose your first language, it becomes archaic to your needs. And so you're really nowhere. You're in a no man's land because you're forgetting one language, especially at a certain age, and you haven't learned the other. So how do you think that plays a role in Quebec with all the immigrants who come here? Do you think that influences how the languages are being changed or formed?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think there's no question that intellectually, at least, I guess one might want to test this out. Intellectually, the sense of the French language in Montreal has changed. I talked before about the possibility of translation. Susan Sontag talks about the right to translate. For a long time, francophones, or the French language in Quebec, was forced to translate. It was forced to translate from English. Since the 80s, I would say that it is now able to translate and open to translation, in the sense that the French language has now become a common language which can embrace many other stories and histories. There are many writers now of non-French Canadian origin who write in French. Marco Micone, Abla Fahoud, I mean, there are many now, and who write in French in Quebec, but out of another imaginative past. Abla Farhoud is Lebanese, Wajdi Muawad is also Lebanese, Marco Miconi, Italian, and these literary influences have shaped a new consciousness of what the French language is in Quebec. And I think that language has changed and become more open. I think it was closed. I think it was, it represented an identity which was a fixed identity, which was not necessarily open to others. I think since the 80s, this has changed a great deal. One of the people who changed this significantly was someone like Gérald Godin, who was not only a remarkable poet, but the author of a policy in the 1980s called Autant de façons d'être québécois, one of the first parti pris nationalists of the 60s to understand that French Quebec had to become a French open to all immigrants, and who was very open to them, and who helped to transform the language. And I think it's through literature, through theater, through Law 101, that the French language has been transformed and opened.
Well, we might take another question.
Sure. I think Martha has.
I just wanted to ask about the Yiddish language in Montreal, which is really, sadly, almost disappearing with the last generation of native Yiddish speakers. But maybe that's a long story, I don't know.
Sure. You want to ask the question now?
Yeah, but mine doesn't have to do with that. So I'll let you answer.
Okay. Yiddish is still there, but it's not the same Yiddish, of course. The Yiddish that you hear on the streets is the Yiddish of the Hasidic community, which has nothing to do with the secular, creative Yiddish that I'm talking about in the 1940s. That story is over. That story lives only in translation. But the story of translation itself is a story that moves. So although at first that literature, the writings of Chava Rosenfarb, of Rocha Korn, of Melech Ravitch, of those important, of J.I. Siegel, those important Yiddish language writers of the 40s were translated into English according to a kind of natural incline, which at the time was that the inheritance of Yiddish would be English, in the same way as many of the Yiddish language writers translated themselves into English language writers. A.M. Klein, his parents were Yiddish speaking. He became an English speaking poet because he went to school in English. So that whole generation was kind of converted in one generation into English language writers. But those who wrote in Yiddish were translated into English. But this story continues, so that now, over the last 10 years, more and more of this Yiddish language writing has been translated into French. Most of you have heard of Pierre Antil, and now Chantal Ringuet. In fact, there was a launch a week ago of an edition of a journal called Möbius, called Les Voix Yiddish, which is a translation of many of these Yiddish language texts into French. So that's fascinating, because here you see you could say, to live in translation is a kind of death, right? Condemned to live in translation. Yiddish language is dead for all intents and purposes. Murdered, finished. But translated into English is one thing. But the significance of this translation into French in Montreal is remarkable, because it means that a new generation, a new population is reading this literature in a new place, in a new time, and in a new way. So translation is an ongoing story.
was around theory more, a little bit different, but when Jean Lamoureux was here, I don't know if it was last week, last week, she said at one point, because Vincent asked her about French theory, she said, well, she said there was no such thing as French theory for us, meaning francophones, because we can agree that that term, French theory, came to be through translation and associated different thinkers, like she said, that were maybe not at all associated to each other in France. And what they wrote was read differently, and we can all agree on that. But I'm wondering, to me, it struck me that something was being dismissed there, because in fact, in Montreal, there's an Anglophone population, and those people were of intellectuals that were reading that theory in translation years later. I mean, the number of years always varies. But I'm interested in that gap because, yes, it's true in Quebec. You know, les gens lisaient Barthes when it was coming out. You know, it was arriving here and you were reading. You were studying with Barthes. You came back, and I'm wondering if you can address a little bit how that coexisted in Montreal, as far as your experience of it, that within maybe, well, obviously within people who read theory, not so many people, but how did that coexist? Was that just like two parallel tracks? Or, do you understand what I'm trying to say? It's that existence of people here reading it in the original at the time, and then this other people, it's not just English Canada, it's also in Montreal. And that's something that we're not really addressing. I mean, I'm not saying you were, that's not particularly, but how did that function in Montreal, I wonder?
It's a great question, and it's a great, I'm not sure that anyone has actually thought about it. I like the fact that you're talking about sort of the francophones who are reading it sort of directly, right, without mediation, and then the anglophones who are reading it through mediation. I think possibly we could make the argument that there's mediation in both cases, that you don't necessarily have the same access or the same contemporaneity. I just want to mention, for instance, that the essays and interviews, just talking about the gap, that I translated with Don Bouchard, they existed in English way before they existed in French. Foucault's essays and interviews were not available in French until the publication of Dix Écrits, which was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and they were really important. You had a text like Qu'est-ce qu'un auteur, which was what is an author, which is, you know, one of the great classic Foucault essays. It was available in English for about 30 years. We worked on typescripts that I don't know how Don Bouchard found them, but they were not available in French as for the most part. So that's really interesting, okay, so that you had more direct access in English than you did in French for certain kinds of things. You also had certain kinds of commentators in English, Paul Robinow, for instance, who did a much more, you know, thorough understanding of Foucault in English than you had in French. So the question of the precedence of one or the other. However, just to go back to sort of those years, I was studying at Université de Montréal, and we had Hélène Sixou come and give us she came to give her seminars in who knows what year, and there were, you know, several important, and Foucault came to give lectures here too as well. So there was a kind of a direct access, and she had a great deal of influence. And you had people like Nicole Brossard, who were directly implicated in those circles here. And you had revues, you know, like Spirale, and you had someone like René Payan, and you had who really were directly engaged with theory as it was being written. So I find your question is interesting, but it would have to be complicated because it's never going to be sort of first in English and second I mean, first in French and second in English.
No, that's not what I mean. I mean the coexistence of that. I mean, the example of Parachute, that's another magazine
Yeah.
that came to be in 75 and, you know, systematically was less so as it moved on, but was really translating everything and had, you know, Vincent brought that up, you know, that in the same issue you could have, c'était quoi Vincent, un texte de Kate Linker and then was, I forget another, but, and, you know, when Jean Lamoureux was there last week, she talked a little bit about that because she was involved in their colloques and so on, and, you know, and we've had Philip Monk here who, you know, was also very much involved and you know, they knew each other, but at the same time, they, you know, I'm not sure they were reading the same things and it was imbricated, that, you know, interrelié. I mean, they were publishing different texts and they were coexisting, but not necessarily, and that's interesting.
In that sense, I think it becomes interesting to think of translation as the model of transmission, that all transmission operates on the principle of translation, that there is no immediacy, that you need these kind of thick mediators, whether it be across language or not. But certainly Montreal becomes a fascinating laboratory, and I think we haven't sufficiently mined that material to look at how ideas have evolved. And we haven't looked enough, I think, at certain kinds of translators. Vincent had mentioned in discussion about, you know, how have we translated as in Quebec, and I was just trying to think of the names of some of the people. I thought of Brian Masumi, I thought of Barbara Goddard, Ginette Michaud in a certain way as a translator of Derrida, even though she stays within French. But, you know, how many, you know, important, or for that matter, Marcel Fournier as the biographer of Bourdieu, but how have we imprinted as Montrealers our knowledge of and our kind of in-between status on the social sciences? I think that's another project.
Yeah, history remembering to be written.
Yes.
Well,
I think there's
yes.
actually another couple of
Yes.
questions, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. Questions are good.
Thanks a lot. It's a really interesting conversation. I was just wondering something you mentioned earlier about institutions and the way that they intersect with the actual practice of translation, say in Montreal, and what those histories were. For instance, the kinds of support that have been offered since the 60s to translators through Canada Council, maybe, or like how those things have evolved and the kinds of values that they have put forward and maybe how they've affected the way that translation happens in the city or doesn't happen. So I was wondering if that was something that you could address or...
I'm thinking of two things. One is that because funding comes through the Canada Council, because translation in Canada is so heavily institutionalized, and that we think French, English, that we miss out on a lot of other different kinds of practices of translation. We miss out on doing international authors, we are also less aware of the kinds of mixing that goes on outside of institutions, like how things operate in the art world and how things operate in the music world. That's a really interesting area that I think has to be explored, is how these kinds of how musicians handle these questions and how translation happens in the music world. But institutionally, I think we're just overwhelmed by official bilingualism, which owns translation in Canada. Translation, official bilingualism. That's what we've got. That's a plus. Americans don't have it, so great, we've got that. But it's limiting at the same time, because it just limits us to that kind of framework that's important to the survival of the Canadian Federation, which seems to work for the moment. But we're closed off from the rest. Of being truly international translators, translators of international literature. We have the competence, but we don't have the institutional will.
Thank you. Is out of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, but what was interesting there, I learned, was that in fact, that there is huge interest in Mexico for Canadian studies, and one of the most strong streams is actually Quebec literature. And it has so much to do with translation, because they will encounter translations of English literature. I'm going to try English Anglophone Canadian literature, but translated into Spanish from Spain, right? Whereas the texts that they have from Quebec, they are translated directly to, not Mexican, but it's just more it's less mediated as opposed to a double mediation, right? And it also made me think about the strength of this program is precisely because whether migration results in people's staying here and calling Quebec home, or if they return or whatnot, that there are very strong transnational connections that make that interest back and forth to study Quebec literature in Mexico, right? And just if you have any thoughts about these connections, transnational connections.
Simply to say that I know that MISC, and in particular Will Straw, has been very active in trying to develop these north-south connections. And I think they're very important. And certainly Spanish is something we should be more attentive to in Quebec. And there's no question that there are affinities between Mexico and Quebec in relation to the United States, which is, the meat of the sandwich. So, and I have recently learned also of the intensity of the connections, which are kind of underground. You don't realize them until you're told. There is a great deal of translation. And the Banff Center works in 3 languages, and and between the 3 countries as well. So there's that institutional connection, which is important. So thank you.
Do we have one final question? No? Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you particularly to Sherry and to Vincent for this really thought-provoking conversation. Really wonderful. Thank you.